Pico Boulevard, Pico Rivera, Pico House. You see this name everywhere in Los Angeles, but I bet you don't know who he was. He was the last governor of California before it became part of the United States, and he was Afro-Latino. Let that satisfying sink in. Of the 44 people who founded Los Angeles in 1781, 26 of them had African ancestry. That is over half. This is the story American history tried to erase, and it almost worked, but not quite, because we're going to tell it right now. To understand Pío Pico, we need to go back further, to a California that looked absolutely nothing like it does today. Way back between the 1500s and 1800s, about 200,000 Africans were brought to New Spain as enslaved people. Over generations, their descendants mixed with Spanish colonizers and indigenous peoples, creating communities of incredibly mixed ancestry. The Spanish Empire had a strict racial classification system called casta, 16 different categories based entirely on your ancestry. At the top stood Spanish-born Europeans. At the bottom stood Africans and indigenous peoples. Your casta determined your entire life. But in frontier regions like Sinaloa and Sonora, things were more flexible. People of mixed ancestry could actually rise through ranks. When Spain decided to colonize Alta California in 1769, they desperately needed settlers. Not many Spaniards volunteered. In 1775, Captain Juan Bautista de Anza led about 240 settlers from Sonora to California. A long journey. Many of them were Afro-Latinos, people of mixed African, indigenous, and Spanish descent. They would shape California's entire future. 6 years later, 11 families were recruited to found a new pueblo. They called it El Pueblo de Nuestra Señora la Reina de los Angeles. The 1781 census recorded the race of each founder. Of the 44 men, women, and children, only 2 were Spanish. 26 were of African descent. 16 were indigenous or mestizo. Los Angeles was founded primarily by black and mixed-race people. Among the families who came with the Anza expedition was the Pico family, and their story would change California history forever. Santiago de la Cruz Pico was a soldier from Sonora. In the 1790 census, he was listed as mestizo, mixed Spanish and Indian. His wife Maria Jacinta de la Bastida was listed as mulata, meaning she had African and Spanish ancestry. Descendant of enslaved peoples, together they traveled over 1,000 miles with the Anza expedition in 1775, bringing 7 children to California. Santiago became a soldier at the San Diego Presidio. His sons followed him into military service. It was the family tradition by then. One of those sons was Jose Maria Pico. Through military service, he moved up in society. By 1790, he was listed as Spanish. This was the flexibility of the California frontier. Your casta could change based on achievements, wealth, or who was doing the counting. Jose Maria married Maria Eustaquia Gutierrez, and they settled at Mission San Gabriel. There, they started building their family together. On May 5, 1801, their son was born. They named him Pío de Jesus Pico. He would become the most famous Pico of them all. Little Pío was born in a shack next to the mission. His family was poor, but he carried blood of soldiers, indigenous, and Africans. When Pío was 4, the family moved to San Diego. His father continued military service until his death in 1819, sadly. Pío never received much formal education. He never learned to read, write, or speak English. But he had something else entirely: ambition. In the 1820s, California was changing. Mexico won independence from Spain in 1821. New opportunities opened up. Pío and his brother Andrés opened a small store together. They traded goods with ships that arrived in San Diego Harbor every month. In 1828, Pío briefly served in the Mexican military. It was enough to earn him his very first land grant from Mexico. In 1829, he received Rancho Jamul, nearly 9,000 acres near San Diego. The poor soldier's son was now a landowner. He turned to cattle ranching with great success. In Mexican California, land was power, and Pío Pico wanted much more land and power. He also entered politics eagerly. In 1832, during political chaos, Pío briefly became acting governor of California first. In 1834, he married Maria Ignacia Alvarado at the Plaza Church in Los Angeles. 800 people attended the wedding. He was appointed administrator of Mission San Luis Rey, one of the largest and richest missions in all of California at that time. When Mexico ordered the secularization of the missions, taking them from the church, Pío oversaw the entire controversial legal process. Through the 1830s and 40s, Pío accumulated more and more land, rancho after rancho. His wealth grew with each passing year. California politics were chaotic during this period. Governors came and went frequently. Factions from north and south fought for control. In 1845, Pío led a revolt against Governor Micheltorena. They met at Cahuenga Pass for a mostly bloodless artillery duel. Micheltorena surrendered to Pico's forces. And Pío de Jesus Pico, grandson of a mulatta from Sonora, became the governor of California. In March 1845, Pío Pico became the last governor of California under Mexican rule. He was 44 years old at the time. One of his first acts was moving the capital from Monterrey down to Los Angeles. The South would finally have its day in the spotlight. By this time, Pío owned over 500,000 acres of California land. That is larger than the entire state of Rhode Island today. His holdings included Rancho Santa Margarita y Las Flores, now Camp Pendleton, half of what is now Whittier, parts of San Fernando Valley. He was one of the wealthiest men in California, an Afro-Latino who had risen from poverty to become both governor and powerful land baron. But Pío could see what was coming clearly. American settlers were flooding into California by the thousands. Mexico could not stop them. In 1846, he called a meeting in Santa Barbara and issued a desperate warning to the citizens. He knew what was happening. Quote, "We find ourselves threatened by hordes of Yankee emigrants who have already begun to flood into our country without any permission. Shall we remain supine while these strangers are overrunning our fertile plains and displacing us? Shall these incursions go unchecked? Shall these incursions continue until we become strangers in our own land?" End quote. Pause and consider those prophetic words carefully. He saw exactly what was about to happen to his people and his land. In July 1846, American troops invaded California territory. Pío desperately tried to raise troops for defense, but Mexico City sent absolutely nothing to help. He could muster only 100 men. Realizing the situation was completely hopeless, Pío sold off mission lands to raise emergency funds for defense. Then he fled to Mexico. The last Mexican governor of California was gone forever. An entire era had ended. Everything his family had built was now under threat. In 1848, Mexico surrendered at last. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo gave California to the United States of America. In 1848, Pío returned to California. Under the treaty, he could become a U.S. citizen. He chose to stay in his homeland. In 1850, California became a state, and the new constitution made its priorities very clear. Things were about to change fast. People of African descent were banned from testifying in court against whites, banned from juries, banned from voting, banned from schools. The relatively flexible racial system of Mexican California was replaced by the rigid segregation of the American South almost overnight. The Land Act of 1851 required all Mexican landowners to prove their claims before a board of land commissioners in San Francisco. The process took years and cost fortunes in legal fees. Many Californio families lost absolutely everything fighting to keep their own land. From 1851 to 56, Pío testified again and again before the board. He defended his own land and dozens of other grants. The Anglo newcomers looked at him and saw a Mexican. Worse, they saw his African features and treated him with open contempt and hostility. One San Francisco attorney described Pío Pico as, quote, a corrupt, non-English-speaking Negroid dwarfist, end quote. Let that sink in. Despite everything against him, Pío managed to hold on to much of his wealth. In the 1850s, he supplied beef to gold rush miners. In 1852, he built a beautiful adobe home on his Rancho Paso de Bartolo near present-day Whittier. He called it El Ranchito. Around this time, Pío developed acromegaly, a disease that caused his features to swell and distort dramatically. He was mocked mercilessly. He compensated by dressing flamboyantly. Jewelry, a top hat, a cane shaped like a woman's leg. If they would stare, he'd give them a show. His wife Maria died in 1854 without children. Pío was alone now, facing a hostile new world that wanted to erase his kind. In 1869, at age 68, Pío made one last grand gesture. He sold San Fernando Valley land and used money for a hotel. The Pico House opened on June 9, 1870, 3 stories tall, 80 rooms, indoor plumbing, gas lighting, a French restaurant. It cost over $80,000, a fortune at the time, and for a few glorious years, it was the center of Los Angeles high society. But Pío had always loved gambling too much, and he kept taking out risky loans. By 1880, he lost the Pico House to foreclosure. Then, in 1883 and 84, devastating floods destroyed much of El Ranchito. His beloved home, his arable land, all gone. His final years were consumed by Pico versus Cone, a lawsuit involving fraudulent loan documents. He claimed he was cheated. Courts disagreed. In 1891, at age 90, Pío Pico was evicted from El Ranchito forever. The very last of his properties was taken from him. The man who once owned over 500,000 acres of California land spent his final years living on charity in his daughter's home. On September 11, 1894, Pío de Jesus Pico died at age 93. He was buried in a pauper's grave with nothing. He had lived under 3 flags: Spanish, Mexican, and American. He had gone from poverty to the governorship and back to poverty again. But the story of Pío Pico did not end with his death. In some ways, the most disturbing part of his story was actually just beginning. In 1884, historian Hubert Howe Bancroft published History of California. It included the 1781 census data. For the first time, the general public learned that the majority of Los Angeles founders had African ancestry. The reaction was immediate. The reaction from Los Angeles's white elite was immediate and hostile. They could not accept that black people had founded their city. Historian J.M. Ginn attacked the founders, calling them, quote, mongrels in race, poor in purse, poor in blood, end quote. Pure hatred. City boosters wanted to attract white Americans to Southern California. They could not have people knowing black Mexicans founded the city, so they created a fantasy instead, a romantic Spanish past of white conquistadors and noble dons. The African heritage was completely erased. By the 1940s, the racial background of the founders was still in some California textbooks. At least some truth remained then. By the 1950s, it was gone completely, erased from the books, erased from public memory, as if it had never happened at all. A plaque honoring the founders was placed at El Pueblo de Los Angeles State Historic Park in the 1950s. It included their races. It mysteriously disappeared without explanation. Rumors said Recreation and Parks commissioners were embarrassed by the African heritage fact. A replacement plaque was installed years later. It honored the founders by name only, but it said absolutely nothing about their true race. For decades, this deliberate erasure stood unchallenged, until two black women decided to fight back against the lies and tell the truth. Her name was Miriam Matthews. In 1927, she became the first credentialed black librarian in all of California history. For decades, she documented black history in Los Angeles. She collected photos, records, and stories that others deliberately ignored. Quote, "It is a sad commentary when the names of black families, Antonio Mesa, Luis Quintero, Jose Moreno, were omitted from history books." In 1978, Mayor Tom Bradley appointed Matthews to the committee planning Los Angeles' 200th birthday celebration. She had one top priority. In her own words, a proper founders monument to be erected in the plaza in the State Historic Park. Finally, it was not easy at all. There were funding problems, there was resistance from officials, but Matthews kept pushing forward relentlessly. On September 4th, 1981, exactly 200 years after the city's founding, a new plaque was unveiled at El Pueblo. This time, it listed all 44 founders, by name, by age, by sex, and by race. 26 of African descent finally acknowledged Miriam Matthews had won her long battle. It took 200 years for Los Angeles to finally tell the truth about who actually founded it. Matthews continued her important work until her death in 2003. Today, a library branch proudly bears her name in Los Angeles. She was not alone in this fight. Publisher Charlotte Abbas also fought for decades to preserve this history. Their work made it possible. Today, Pío Pico's name is everywhere in Los Angeles. Pico Boulevard runs for miles through the city. The Pico House still stands at Plaza. You can visit El Ranchito, now Pío Pico State Historic Park, and walk through the home he built. It has been fully restored for visitors. Pico Rivera, Pico Union, 2 elementary schools, a metro station, even a power plant bears his name. His legacy is literally everywhere. But his real legacy is not a name on a street. It is a reminder that the history we are taught is not always the complete true story. People of African descent did not just contribute to California. They founded it. They governed it. They shaped it from the very beginning. And history, once erased, can be restored if we fight for it. If you learned something today, share this video. This story must be told.